Good evening, friends. Welcome to yet another Word of Gord. Average folks in the afterlife. Are we actually up to number 90? Oh, we're very close if we're not. Continuing on with Frederick Sculthorp and his marvelously detailed book of OBE experiences, excursions into the spirit world. But first, I'd like to read to you from a contemporary memoir that I'm reading that reflects strongly on a point that Frederick made on one of his visits to one of the unhappy communities in the lower astral, where people were squabbling, sort of mean, selfish types. And he observed on the edge of this town, after wanting to leave because he couldn't handle it anymore, sort of little hutches and homes for pets, and was told that somebody had had the idea that these souls, so turned in on themselves and selfish and not at all caring for anyone else, might benefit from giving some love to pets. And that's why they were there. And not an entirely unusual idea in terms of human psychology and perceptions of it, but yet another instance of how psychological and emotional complexes continue on into the afterlife. Anyway, I'm reading a book called Mother American Night by John Perry Barlow. He reached some measure of fame through a number of life projects. He wrote a number of now quite well-loved and famous songs performed by the Grateful Dead. He wrote them with Bob Weir, and many love him for that. And you would know some of those songs. A lot of the songs, of course, were written by Robert Hunter and Jerry Garcia, but quite a few were written by Weir Barlow, and you can check the references there. And then later he became one of the early adopters of internet, and not just the technology, but the ideal to fight for internet freedom away from those who would control it. He helped found the Electronic Freedom Foundation, amongst other things. Anyway, his book is filled with interesting anecdotes and amusing insights into all sorts of situations and people that he met. And the love of his life, or so he claims, and he'd already been married and raised 3 children at this point, had an underlying genetic condition which caused her to die suddenly on a flight, when they thought all that happened was she was having trouble fighting off a flu. Anyway, it happened when he was middle-aged and deeply shocked. And there's a short chapter after that which details some of his recovery, which relates exactly to the situation Frederick Sculthorp mentioned. So allow me to read that. When I went into rehab, I was smoking 3 packs of Marlboro Lights a day. I was 20 pounds overweight and sleeping 3 hours a night, and had pretty much succeeded in creating jet lag as a poetic art form. I'd also started drinking again, which was worrisome because I hadn't been drinking at all during the time I was with Cynthia, his love. But it didn't seem to me like my drinking was really out of control. I realized I needed to be someplace where I could cry as much as I was compelled to do without freaking out everybody around me. About 2 weeks after Cynthia died, I went into rehab at St. Helena Hospital in Napa. I chose it because Bob Weir had checked himself in there a couple of days before. In addition, they had offered Cynthia a job once. The second I announced my intention to go there, Weir announced his intention to leave, which I didn't think was a coincidence, but I also understood it because of how well I knew Weir. And obviously that relates to a lot of challenges they had in their songwriting and friendship relationship, going right back to college. They met in college. I stayed at Helena for about 3 weeks. It was a traditional 12-step program, and I went to a lot of meetings. I was in a group one day when a woman started talking about the reason she had come there. It was because her kitten had died, and it had totally unhinged her, and she'd gone off on a bender. She started to cry. Someone else started talking about he'd lost his dog, and that was the worst thing that had ever happened to him. There was a really rough longshoreman, whom I had not seen shed a tear the whole time I had been there, and he started talking about a pet duck that he had that had been killed by dogs, and he started to cry like a baby. I was sitting there thinking, this guy's crying about a duck? What about me, guys? I had a little bit of loss here myself. I started to say something about it, and then I suddenly realized that what they were all mourning was the only form of unconditional love they had ever been willing to accept. The closest they had ever gotten to it was from a pet, because they could not accept it from a human being, which is something that most people cannot do. Also, I had to count myself as having been incredibly lucky to have experienced it with another human being. Barlow talks about one of the major themes elsewhere in his life was learning how to accept love. So that's just another example of it. There are many in the book, but I really wanted you to hear that. Pets as the conduits to unconditional love. It goes on in the afterlife too, as do many other human complexes and weird motivations. That's not a weird motivation, that's some Belgian ale. So on with our friend Frederick, our good friend Frederick. Well, I'm getting the feeling now he's twigged somewhere in spirit that we're doing this. And I don't think the book's gotten much attention for many years, so he's pretty darn pleased about that, I suspect. I cannot do psychometry in the physical body, but it is automatic and easy when I'm in the sensitive spirit body. Projected from bed, I found myself walking on a road entering a small country town. There were other people walking in the same direction, and I sensed the feeling of incommemoration. Presently several mounted men passed, hauling gun carriages. I looked behind, and the last one, with a mischievous smile on his face, reined his horses so close to me that I had to scramble up a bank to get out of his way. And then they stopped. I walked along the bank to have a word with this reckless rider, but when I came up to him, I was completely disarmed by his most friendly and charming smile. I was then surprised to see that he was wearing a helmet of Cromwell's time, but instead of the usual breastplate generally shown in pictures of that period, he had a jacket with thick leather flaps attached to it. Then I contacted his aura. It was a shock to me. His personality was the strongest I have ever met in all my spirit experiences. He was a hardened campaigner without the slightest fear, and I sensed his numerous sorties and battles, all waged with the most cheerful recklessness, and as if they had only just happened. It was rather overpowering, and I walked around to inspect the gun carriage, as I was curious to see how it compared with ours of the First World War. It was crude and simple with heavy iron fittings, and when I touched one of the wheels, I seemed to witness the whole of the Civil War in 1642. Battles, skirmishes, lootings, burning farmhouses, misery, triumphs, the heat of the summer and the slush and cold of the winter. My sensitive spirit body was automatically psychometrizing this etheric relic of the past war, of a past war. I felt sick and depleted and left to join some people entering a house which overlooked the market square, where the expected commemoration was about to take place. I waited at the window but was not interested owing to the effect of the psychometry and wished to return to the body. I was returned, became physically conscious, saw the symbol of astral projection on the ceiling, and then mentally asked, "Why all this?" The reply was, "What is the date?" I turned on the lights. It was 2 a.m., and the new day was the 11th of November, the day we commemorate the signing of the armistice of the First World War. Interesting that that's his view, and now it's much broader. But anyway, I wish I'd spoken to this man to hear his style of speech. Also, I was curious about the leather flaps, but I later found a reference to these in a local library. They were often worn by the lower ranks as a protection from sword cuts and the like. I was once projected to a dockside in spirit and was interested in a refrigerator ship there. As I had never been over one of these, I decided to inspect it and walked onto the deck. After a few paces, my spirit body had the most unpleasant feeling, and a few more paces produced a sense of unspeakable terror and helplessness. I simply ran off the ship and wanted to get away from it. A young couple nearby were about to leave in a small yacht, and I joined them. Sitting in the boat, I wondered what caused this fright, and was told that the ship was impregnated with the terror emanating from the bodies of the slaughtered animals it had carried. I do not think that these animals were slaughtered in the quick and humane manner we are led to believe. This etheric counterpart of an earthly ship held its impressions just like the gun carriage I had contacted, and had the same effect on my spirit body. Psychometry can be very unpleasant, as it seems to affect the whole body. Some may think that uncanny things happen in the next world. They do, but they are rather different from what is expected. I had been taken to a children's creche or nursery, a very bright place, the corridors and rooms being all in white. I was watching some small children in one of the rooms when through the open door bounded a dog. It was one of those big stuffed rag dogs with button eyes and a comical bent feet that children love to play with. But I was astonished when I saw that the thing was moving like a real dog. My earthly mind had at least expected some stiff mechanical or clockwork movement, but every action had the perfect mannerisms of a live animal. It was something that could never be seen on Earth, and the suddenness gave me a most uncanny feeling, which I cannot describe. Presently an older girl, who appeared to be in charge of the little ones, saw the dog and said, "Johnny, what are you doing here? Get back to your room." And Johnny obediently turned and went out through the door. I sensed that this toy was animated by an advanced spirit in charge of the place. Earthly interests are often retained by the spirit mind for a long time. Many years ago I had a mandolin and was slow in memorizing some of the pieces I used to play, which meant much concentration on the music and searching for the frets on the instrument. In a house in spirit, I saw a mandolin with its plectrum, picked it up and played Beethoven's Minuet in G without a mistake, remembering every note and its position. The subtle electrical spirit mind was unhampered by the physical body. I've had a couple of experiences where I'm obviously not great, but a better musician than I am here. So I can corroborate that one. And also composing. I seem to have composed music in spirit world. In the between life state before this birth, I believe, not, in a past incarnation, I didn't put it in any of my books because it just seemed a little too wild and crazy, and I couldn't quite countenance it myself. I seem to have also started a music school, or helped start a music school, with some very interesting architecture. But there again, we're all, how shall I say, in an expanded state in spirit between incarnations. We're much sort of greater, bigger, wider, deeper when we're there than when we're here. We only bring part of ourselves back here in order for the other, some part to grow. If you bring your full spirit self here, all 100%, there's too much of you and there's no room for growth. Older souls like us tend to bring, I'd say 20, 30, 40%. and younger souls. I mean, this is covered in some of the past life regression and between life regression books, as some of you will perhaps know. And but that's my take on it. You have to leave a good chunk of it behind, else you're too smart and wise and know-it-all kind of thing, and there's no space left for growth. So you leave a whole big chunk of yourself back there, so that the empty space, as it were, can ignite growth, fresh growth. On one occasion, my wife took me to a concert on the other side. There were the usual stage or platform, and one of the performers was a singer. I liked his voice, but I thought his gestures were rather overdone. As I thought he glanced quickly in my direction and modified his movements. Towards the end of the song, however, he began to use his arms again very freely, and in the grand finale, I thought he looked silly. After he had finished, he walked to the front of the stage and stared at me with a look of annoyance. Much to my relief, we got up and left the hall, but in a rather thoughtful mood. And outside, I suddenly realized that the singer had received all my thoughts. I am afraid that earthly habits like this must take time to correct. You wonder about the thoughts of the other attendees. Maybe they weren't critical. Maybe the critical ones made a beeline for his spirit. But I've wondered about that in concert situations that I've been in, that I've described either in books or in the videos. Because you're in situations where there's quite often famous dead musicians, and the people that are there are, also dead, of course, but they're there because they're fans, and there's a great sense of love and happiness at being reunited with their favorite musicians, whatever genre it is, doesn't really matter. And I've wondered about that. I haven't resolved that particular question for you or myself, but let's ponder on that one, shall we? Many things seem to emphasize the earth-like qualities of some of the spheres. I once saw the empty hulk of an old wooden ship moored to the bank of what appeared to be an estuary. A strange noise came from the ship now and again, and I went on board to investigate. I found that there was a slight swell in the water, which sometimes caused the rudder to move with a harsh, grinding sound. How very much like the earth, I thought. Indeed. The creaking of wood on the hull of a ship. There's an ancient sound. Once I was projected to a room in a museum, and I was deposited on a chair, and as I became conscious and began to notice surroundings, a man appeared, evidently surprised by my sudden appearance in an unformed state. He was curious and wanted to touch me, but when he was about an arm's length away, he suddenly jumped back as if he'd received an electrical shock. He tried it several times and began to look like a cat round a hedgehog. Now fully conscious, I stood up and said, "You need healing," and grasped his hands. He immediately sank to the floor as if in a faint. I do not know why I did this, and may have been prompted by my spirit helper, and although surprised, I was not perturbed and left him comfortably sleeping, knowing he would soon recover. I believe this was the effect of the quote-unquote difference of potential mentioned earlier. On a dull day in winter, I had projected from an armchair beside the fire and had been taken to my house in spirit. Soon after I arrived, the room began to appear alternately light and dark, like the effect of a cinema projector running too slowly. It had a very disagreeable effect on me and seemed like an earthly headache, but with a quicker drumming and intensity. It was not to be endured, and I was drawn back to the body. The headache continued until I had regained full physical consciousness. I found that it was caused by a gaseous piece of coal flickering on a hitherto dull fire. The incident interested me considerably because in this case my physical body had no discomfort, and the cause seemed trivial. I believe that the flickering light of the coal had some effect on the physical body, or even directly on the astral cord, causing a quickly alternating wavelength or vibration which would only affect the spirit body. There is a cataleptic state on returning to the physical body also. but this is realized only if one tries to move at once. On returning from my earlier projections, I was quite content to lie and watch the symbol on the ceiling of the bedroom. Then one night I projected while lying on my side. When I returned, I at once tried to roll over on my back, a very simple operation, but I was absolutely powerless and frightened. However, in a few seconds, which my fright seemed ages, full power returned. Anyway, it was an instructive experience, and it made me fully realize that I and my physical body are two different parts. I had been away, and on my return, I must permeate my brain in order to give my orders through my nerves as to what muscles I wish to use for this physical condition. Later, when I became experienced, I thought it fun on returning to the armchair to try quickly to raise an arm which appeared to be as lifeless as a piece of wood until I got into it. On return, the life force seems to pour back into the physical body, first to the mentality and eyes, then to the body and the extremities. A day projection seems to give rest and refreshment and is not like an afternoon nap when one is apt to get up yawning and stretching. There were many experiments I wanted to make to study the spirit world, but one's purposes are difficult to remember when out of the body. I have tried levitation or lifting the spirit body by will. This appears to be a case of different states, different powers. In a lower sphere in a dull astral town, I could only rise as high as the rooftops by great effort of will, but could not hold it and sank again. In another sphere, which was as brilliant as a tropical noon, my spirit body had the feeling of lightness and strength, and I could easily land on the top of a high white building. I was once tested in this respect, but it was no disconcerting examination. I was on a bright plane with a group of smiling friends who gently suggested I might right a child's sailing boat that had fallen on its side in the middle of a pond. I found it quite easy to hover over the water and then reach down to do this. Now it was suggested I should go to a white building some distance away and return without stopping. This also, I found, was easy. I travelled in a delightful glide in a forward-leaning attitude, and, as of course it is done by thought, everything happened as I wished. I made an easy turn at the building and then returned to the group to be greeted by smiles and congratulations. I ought to have looked, if I may say so, rather graceful, if not angelic. It may be some consolation to those who study spiritual truths and wish to learn, to know that often a so-called dream is a spirit experience, and although only a hazy recollection is brought back to the physical mind, the memory of it is fully retained by the spirit mind. And yes, I think we've all had examples of that, of the so-called dream. And when I have clients come to see me, and I often tell them that, see that dream you're obsessing over? That's a spiritual experience. That's something that happened when you were out of body. And they're intrigued by it. They're not necessarily convinced, but I do find myself saying it a lot over the years. This is one of the methods used by spirit teachers to teach those on earth, and I know that the knowledge is retained because I have had so many of these dream experiences, and then, when later projected, I have remembered them and have been somewhat prepared. My account of levitation in spirit may sound rather simple, but I already experienced it in the dream state and knew something of the mental effort required. I should imagine that a newcomer in spirit life who did not know of the possibilities might have some difficulties in levitating, and the chief obstacle would be doubt. So it is better to know of these things. The chief obstacle would be doubt. I have trouble convincing people of that. I talk about rather than, I mean, obviously you can be inspired by my experiences, whether I talk about them or write about them, but you have to have them in and of yourself. In order to extinguish doubt, you need personal experience. And that is gained through out-of-body travel, lucid dreaming, etc., etc. And this is where often researchers fall down because they do great, how shall I say, high quality research, but they can't compare it to their own experiences because they often don't either have very few or none at all. And I can see when I talk to them, they're still, despite all their gathering of experiences of others, there's still a large amount of doubt in their own minds, and they often feel that doubt is a useful tool. And, and they may be right. I think it holds you back, but maybe the way it holds people back reduces them to a speed of advancement that they're comfortable with. And maybe that speed was way too slow for me. So again, different strokes for different folks. That's one of those 70s thing, you younger folks might not know that one. Does it go back to a Sly and the Family Stone record? I'm not sure. It might. My account of levitation in spirit may sound rather simple, but I had already experienced it in the dream state and knew something of the mental effort required. I should imagine that a newcomer to spirit life who did not know of the possibilities might have some difficulties in levitating, and the chief obstacle would be doubt. Again, I had a startling lesson in this direction once, and it was throw him in and see if he can swim kind of test. I had been projected and had lost consciousness. Yes, that's a troubling thing to have happen. And on regaining it, the first thing I saw was some swiftly moving grass beneath me. I was in a forward-leaning position and for the moment thought I had been tossed from a horse and swooped still closer to the grass. Lifting my face upwards in an effort to miss the grass, I rose again. This natural thought happened to be the right one, the desire to avoid, and I found that I was crossing a large grassy plain. In the distance I could see a village on a hill and sensed that this was my destination. Levitation and effortless flight are a delight and quite a novelty at first, but I believe that they are used only for speed and to cover distances, because in spirit, walking is also effortless and a pleasure. Besides, it would be our habitual way of seeing the countryside and its attractions. Also, usually there's plenty of time. I had an excursion into an intermediate sphere, a seaside resort where spirits were regaining strength and becoming acclimatized. I was looking into the buildings near the beach, and in one there was a band and people were dancing. I went through an adjoining door and found myself in a dressing room where women were preparing for a bathe in the sea. I did a quick right-about turn and went out through the door again, hoping I hadn't been noticed. For the benefit of psychic science, I would like to have it noted that the spirit face does not blush, but the spirit can feel very silly. Of course, some spirits could change into bathing attire by thought. Some would not want to change at all, and others would have to go through the earthly way of changing, according to their mental development. I have been taken to several drinking places in spirit, and I do not think I was visible to the people there. They seem to be habitual meeting places of like-minded people, and the drinks do not appear to have any enlivening or intoxicating effect. One place I visited was an old tavern on the seafront, which still seemed to have the appearance of the early 18th century. The proprietor was a large, angular-looking individual with a sun-tanned face and buckled shoes, who looked like an ex-buccaneer basking in respectable retirement. Hanging on the wall were some flat miniature wooden barrels with leather slings, and I saw one customer leave with one hanging from his shoulder like a military water bottle. I think these were used instead of leather bottles. And add an example of telepathy during normal waking consciousness. One afternoon in my shop on Earth, I suddenly had the impression that my sister-in-law would be visiting us. A weekday call would be unusual, but I had received the impression of her personality so strongly, I made a note of time. Half an hour later, my sister-in-law walked into the shop, and her first words were, "Did you get anything?" She told me that before leaving her house, she visualized herself as standing in front of me and saying that she would be calling, and her time coincided with mine. The fact that this subtle and interrupted message reached the right person among the 10 million other people of Greater London would be considered by many as either a myth or a miraculous. It is neither. Telepathy is a projection of thought on the personal wavelength, which conjoins with the personality thought of. How the personal wavelength is formed and why it is unique and individual, I have tried to explain on an earlier page. And I've tried to explain it myself from time to time. It's not easy. I was once on the outskirts of a town in spirit and was watching some Australians playing cricket. Although they were in their shirt sleeves, I sensed that they were soldiers of the First World War called the Australian Light Horse, and still wearing their riding breeches. Knowing that object could be directed by thought, I had the mischievous idea of directing the ball around the player's bat. I then thought it would not be right to interfere, so I walked into town looking for some object to use. I found an apple in the street and saw nearby a tall lamp standard with metal scrollwork at the top. I tossed the apple up and it directed it to a certain spot on the scrollwork. It went straight to my chosen spot, but just before it touched it, it turned aside and went to another spot. I was surprised. Then I heard a laugh at my side. My guide had played some trick on me, and I was going to try on the cricketers, the same trick. On another occasion, I was brought to a village. When I arrived, I watched some men playing darts in a tavern, and one of them handed me a dart and asked me to try my luck. This was easy. My thought-guided missile clearly found dead center of the board, and after a pause, I suddenly turned and left the place. Later, my very abrupt departure from this place surprised me, and I have an idea that my invisible helper had detected suspicion in the minds of the lads of the village that they had been used in a little thought experiment, hence my evasive action. And again, I'll pause here. Much more interesting stuff to come. Still another, oh goodness, 20, 30 pages. Fascinating stuff, huh? Yes, this notion of how people play sports without using their minds to direct the ball to their advantage is a puzzle to me still. I've seen some of the things he's seen, but that's the lower astral when people don't have much mental control. Higher up, of course, they can control any ball anywhere. So what do? Agree to not do it as teams, or to have the mental control, the efforts at mental control, be one more part of their competition? In the way that they, shoot the ball, score, tackle, pass, the ball. Is it just seen as another technique? I'm not sure. But I've definitely seen it and wondered if they're just using their minds and keeping props around. Anyway, it's an interesting, fascinating situation, and I suspect the answer is a bit of both. On lower levels, they can't control it. They can't do that telepathic thing of, the flower or the plant sends a message to the deva that hovers over the town. And some of the devas are quite big, and they can make themselves visible or invisible. They're like archangels or, something like that. The more highly evolved devas, anyway. Maybe I'll just, interview some dead athlete sometime. Maybe that'll help. But as with a lot of things, the answers, as Frederick has said, depends on which level, which plane the speaker is residing in. You reach your comfort level, and your consciousness adapts to whatever the realities are on your comfort level in spirit. That will be slightly different in slightly different areas. Some are quite crabbed and small and pinched, and others are very expansive. Expansive in the extreme, I might add. So, with that in mind, let's end this particular episode and look forward to the next. Au revoir, mes amis.